to the show. Gordon, how are you getting on?
Too bad. Good morning, lads.
Just on that point of, I guess, these New Zealand tours and these tours to the Southern Hemisphere in general, it feels like it's almost a pattern at this stage that the year before the World Cup, Ireland would go down there and play at least one test in New Zealand. From your own playing days, was that something that was generally spoken about, like the World Cup, was that generally spoken about all the time, as if New Zealand were this sort of preparatory expedition in order to get ready for the big one following a year later?
No, not really. Like, I suppose when you get to this stage in the season, there's probably I wouldn't even say there's any players involved in the conversations. It's the coaches are, probably have some webs in their head that they want to see play out over the next kind of 15, 16 months. But from players, like, you look at the volume of rugby that's gone through, there is a certain bit about just getting the energy tanks just re-established and trying to get ready for what is the toughest tour in the professional era. You go back to that tour in 97 to New Zealand, I think it was 97. Yeah, I think it was 97 that went. This is obviously, we're better prepared going. It's not a development tour, but this is akin to that. But from the players' perspective, I'd say there's guys looking to reinforce any potential the coaches might see in them in their heads, and for other players, it's just to stay there. But like, I think you can't get away from the enormity of this challenge. Like, I look at it on paper and I'm just like, it is really going to be a brutal tour.
What is the area of this squad then that would give you most concern when it comes to the brutality? So I guess when we're talking about areas of squad depth here.
No, that's not. I think it's, you playing the All Blacks 3 games in a row is tough enough, but you're putting in the Maori into that. Like, there is no easy game there. So, and starting with the Maori, they'll want to set the tone for the tour, and there's this weird thing in New Zealand that they almost take it as a national. They're taking that Ireland have beaten them is it 3 out of the last 5 times as a national insult. So the Maori will be looking to soften up players ahead of the first test. I think it's unfair maybe to pick apart the squads at this stage, because we've got to see how they perform. There's cases for people being left out, and there's cases for everybody that's in there. I suppose we still have some of the inherent, we probably don't have some of the injuries will probably be a concern going. No Ronan Gallagher and no Robert Balogun too, that probably jump out.
The questions that that are inherent to the squad, if you want to continue this theme, and they just won't go away, Gordon, is the questions regarding the number 10 position. And if we get into a conversation around squad depth, I think you don't even need to go that far to accept that maybe Sexton won't play every game in this tour. I don't think that's exactly a hot take, that he's not going to be available for every single minute. Do you have greater concerns or fewer concerns, say, compared to the end of the Six Nations, when it comes to Ireland's depth at 10?
Yeah, I think it's undecided, and I think we can't. There is no. There's potentially one of the young guys in Munster may come into the reckoning, depending on what game time they get in Munster next year. But if you just look at the players that are on at hand, Ross Byrne didn't give the greatest showing of himself. Jack Harty at the weekend. Jack Harty is injured, and they've kind of decided on those two. So unless somebody else emerges, they're just trying to get Harry Byrne to stay fit and to see, can he compete at this level, and trying to play Joey Carberry back into form again. He's not injured this time, but they're really trying to decide, I think, on what the pecking order is. And they picked 3 out halves, and there's every chance these could be the 3 out halves that go to the World Cup next year. And they're just trying to see what the best use of these resources is. But I still think there is, we're dealing in the squad we have. Like, they just need to figure out who's going to play, who's going to start those tests if Johnny isn't, and that's not clear, because you have two at halves who have different problems to solve. Joey is hasn't thrived in the latter half of the season, and is probably a little bit, looks a little bit shy on confidence. And players, and I suppose people talking about maybe he should be shifting to 15 with what's his name, shifting into 10, which was
Carberry at 15.
Carberry at 15, and Ben Healy coming into 10, and I'm not sure that helps anyone in an Irish case. But it's just, I suppose, was a reflection on the malaise in the Munster attack in the last couple of games. And Harry Byrne has all the talent in the world, but can't stay fit, and whenever he plays, he tends to force the game. So I think they just they're putting these guys in and giving them every chance to cement themselves, because that's the age-old thing, isn't it? Sometimes it's harder to get out of a national team. To any good performances from either of those players could go a long way over the next kind of 15 months.
I do find the Harry Byrne conversation very interesting, given that in front of him you've Johnny Sexton, who, as we've just said, is probably not going to play all the time in this tour, and Joey Carberry, who is injury prone. So Harry Byrne could, it's not unreasonable to think, be thrown into the deep end in this tour. Is this potentially a sort of sink or swim moment for him? I know it's very early in his career and he's had injury troubles that have sort of delayed his emergence, but do you think this could be a very, very big few months for him?
It could be. I would be surprised if he gets first shot at the title. I would say there is a Carberry, Harry Byrne. It's between those two. This is a, it's almost like a Lions tour going into it. You've got the Maori first. There's going to be game time. Split between them. You would expect Sexton to start the first test, and whoever performs better in that Maori test to be able to get the option off the bench. So it really is fighting. You're absolutely right. Both of them. This will have a monumental impact on their pecking order and their careers in the next 15 months. So that is, and Farrell will absolutely look to tap into that. The fact that he's bringing Sexton and he's captaining this tour just goes, listen, we know we signed the contract to the World Cup. He's kind of going, listen, he's number one, and you guys need to figure out who's number two. And then you can start working about how to manage those resources.
Just at this stage of the season, Gordon, we spoke about like Josh Cullen. Stephen Kenny referenced it last night. He's had 60 games this season. Like, what's it like for a rugby player in the middle of June to have this ahead of you? And as you mentioned, the Maori aspect to it as well. Some of these guys coming off a really long season with particularly Leinster and so on.
Yeah, it's not like, it isn't easy, because you're at this really weird balance, because you need to maintain a kind of physical element in the gym. Pitch sessions has to come right down. The volume you can do on a pitch has to come right down. So your ability to practice at a really, really intense level going into the most intense portion of the season it's really hard. And you're kind of a victim of how you perform. You will either, if you hit the ground running, you can just carry that momentum into it. But on the other side of the fence is you've got New Zealand, who are really, really well rested. They've come off the back of most of them only play half of the Super Rugby, so they're coming in super well rested, not a huge amount of game time in it under their belts, and they seem to benefit from that. And they're at the, so the energy levels is really hard. I think it was on one of the tours we had 2 games in New Zealand, and I think it was maybe somewhere in the mid 2000s with 2 games in New Zealand and 1 in Australia. And we should have won one of those 2 tests in New Zealand, and we lost them in the dying embers of the match. But we went to Australia and we were doing really well. It wasn't a particularly great Australia team, but we just ran out of gas. 55 minutes, the parachute came up and we just didn't have anything in the gas. And Australia, kind of stole it in the last 15 minutes, and that was really hard. But you're pretty physically broken at the end of that. And I was just thinking, if you'd add in 2 more matches into that, you don't know where you go. And that's what I keep thinking. This is a Six Nations played over 3.5 weeks.
That's 2006 that you're referring to, and it's 34-23 is the first test against New Zealand, 27-17 is the second test against New Zealand, and then 37-15 against the Wallabies is the third test. So I presume you start and play in all three tests. I presume come test 3, you're, even before kick-off, you're like, I'm a bit screwed here.
Not that you're a bit screwed. You're just there going like your confidence is not confidence, but the frustration of being close. And I know those scorelines don't necessarily reflect how close the games were, but we were. There was one of the I think it was the second test in particular. We gave up a try in like the last 5 or 6 minutes. But you had to carry that momentum there. You got to travel, get on a plane, go over, and yeah, there's a physical thing. Like I think that was my 32nd game or something that season. And if you look at across the paddock, you know, these guys were probably barely into 15 games, and like that does take its toll. How they perform, like this will be all around momentum. Like Ireland need to get a win. They arguably need to win the first two matches to have a chance of doing something on that tour. There's an awful lot of pressure on New Zealand to perform as well in those 2 matches. But from an Irish perspective, you know, without trying to get, you know, there's a bit of a grey cloud over Irish rugby, particularly with just in the last couple of weeks with Munster's exit, and Leinster and Ulster following suit almost in consecutive weeks. But there's a huge amount of pressure on New Zealand to perform in this tour. But from Ireland for this tour not to spiral into something that you're scrambling to pick up the pieces from, they need to perform and win one of the first 2 matches.
Let's talk about the provincial aspect of this then. What have you seen over the last few weeks that will give you the greatest cause of concern when you take that evidence and bring it to the Ireland camp?
I think that you don't necessarily carry your form from your province into it. I suppose what would be of potentially a bit of concern would be players carrying their form into camp. And it's not across the board. I think you know, and players missing, and they kind of name checked Kelleher and Balakoon definitely as 2 that are going to be missed. But I think it's more the kind of squad resources in it. And if you look, and you know, we picked 3 number 8s in the squad, which, you know, you're playing Caelan Doris at his second best position. I think he struggled in the bigger games at playing at a 6. I don't think he is naturally a 6. So you kind of look, the only other person in the squad that's an out-and-out 6 is Peter O'Mahony. So, you know, the squad just looks, I think from players coming in with the form they're coming in, I don't think too many players are coming in on red hot form. I think Henshaw is arguably there. James Hume is arguably there. Gibson-Park has been, you know, a little bit flat in the last 2 games. Ty Byrne is definitely, you know, just looks like he's a man who started nearly every game he's available for this season. And I think they're the players that tend to offer you game-breaking moments in games, and if they're a little bit flat coming into this tour, that could be a worry.
Can I ask you about Leinster then? In your piece in the Irish Times this morning, you said that Leinster remain vulnerable to big physical teams, as was evidenced over the last few weeks. Was your sense earlier in the season, Gordon, that they had corrected those vulnerabilities somewhat, and that this is maybe a little bit surprising what's transpired over the last little while?
Yeah, like I think we probably get carried away with Leinster because they're so dominant during the early part of the season, and the disrupted European Cup kind of sent over a mismatch of games. I think there's only so much you can coach yourself out of a problem. There are other teams with bigger budgets and bigger people that we're kind of leaving it more to chance that to try and be perfect on a day. And that's with the current squad, with the current way we approach the kind of match day 23, like the only overseas player that say Leinster have is Alala Toa, and he's on the bench, so he's not starting. But when you look and say most other European wins, there will always be a kind of a little kind of sprinkle of just international class that can be the difference in games. And I think, when Leinster's and their line-out struggled and their set-piece struggled, we didn't really have a second way to regenerate quick ball, which is the kind of fulcrum to everything that Leinster do. And we didn't have a particularly good, we don't have, our kicking game isn't, to regather isn't what it used to be. Our counter-attack probably isn't as dangerous as other teams. So we struggled, and we don't have that player that you can just pop the ball to that can just generate quick ball more often than not.
Is there a sense now that what's coming through at the Leinster Academy will get them so far and will still allow them to, be very, very competitive on all fronts, but that sprinkling of international class will need to be sourced from elsewhere?
Yeah, and I think you got Jason Jenkins coming in next season, and I think he would have potentially solved this year's problems, because if you look and say when Joe McCarthy came on in against La Rochelle, he that kind of tight, he was the tighter loose headlock. He came in and he scrummaged for his life, and we didn't give up a penalty. So I think that's going to help solve one of those issues. But is that enough across the board? When we have won, there has been big players, big international players, big foreign signings that have made, have made contributions across a thing that just changed the whole dynamic of it. And I think they've also fed into players. Like, I'm a better player from playing with Felipe, better player from playing with Issa. So there's players like that, Nathan Spooner, there's guys like that just give you a different insight into how the game. So it's not just about winning matches. That's what they're primarily to do, but they do add to the way players perceive the game and interpret it. And yeah, I think to have all those players, like, it would be a noble goal to win with everyone being, through the Leinster Academy. But it is a good academy. I don't think it's good enough to beat bigger budgets out of France and the UK.
Like, that's quite interesting. And so, like, the knock-on impact of that would be interesting as well, Gordon, over the next little while, that if they do bring in maybe one or two additional signings than Jason Jenkins, just for example, the knock-on impact that would have on some of the more talented players coming through from the academy who may not necessarily be on an international class level, but would be able to bring, I'm not sure, does it bolster up their squad? Does it essentially become a case where the Leinster Academy becomes an even bigger feeder for other provinces in Ireland, or what the knock-on impact of that would be, a few more international signings for Leinster?
Yeah, but they have them next year, and I think it's the you have Jenkins. There is Charlie Naitai. If I have that name wrong, I probably do. He's coming in as a centre. He's coming in from Leon, and you have Alatoa. But there's none of those three are guaranteed to start if we were in the Champions Cup final next year. I'd say Jason Jenkins probably is just purely on size. Because the Gatlin's great quote: "You can't coach a guy to be 6'8" and 130 kilos." And whether we get away from that or not, that's what Leinster needed. They needed a bit of size, because in both games, when our set piece has been disrupted, and our set piece was disrupted because we looked a little small, and then we weren't. So we were disrupted at set piece, and that had the knock-on effect across the game that we don't have like, you look at, what the Stormers were able to do. They were able to give the ball to Evan Roos, and he's just dynamically carrying over the gain line. Marcel Coetzee, he did the same. That is the game they're built for. But when we were asking Caelan Doris and Jack Conan to carry into South Africans off slow to medium ball, we struggled. We really, really did, because we're not built for that type. We're not put together for that type of game. We are built for that high tempo game, but we need to be able to protect for the other side, because that's what New Zealand are going to look at from that. They're going to look at the template that France did, where they disrupted our set piece in Paris for 50% of the game. They're going to look at the pressure Dan Sheahan was put over, 3 pods going up nearly every time in every line out, and put him under severe pressure. So the calling of the line out will be really important. The scrum looked, our scrum looked shaky. Leinster's looks shaky. You've got there doesn't seem to be huge amounts experience in behind Tig. So there is concerns around that in broader context.
All right, Gordon, great stuff. Thanks a million for being with us this morning.
Thanks a million.
Cheers. Gordon Darcy there on the line, looking at that 40-man squad for Ireland, and a few Leinster reflections there as well.